Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's Enrichment Series webinar. I am your host, Amir Ganad, and I am here with our guest speaker, Damon Jones. We are very fortunate to have Damon with us. Damon leads efforts to ensure the world's largest consumer goods company is recognized as one of the most trusted brands in the world. He leads a global organization responsible for P&G's image and reputation and that of its nearly 100 brands. P&G's global communications discipline includes brand and corporate communications, digital and social media, stakeholder engagement, issues advocacy, and crisis management. Leveraging P&G's significant industry presence, advertising spending, and convening power, Damon also directs a board portfolio of citizenship and advocacy efforts focused on driving equality for women, people of color, and other underrepresented groups. A trusted advisor to the C-suite, Damon has a proven track record of leveraging reputation and relationships to drive brand and business success while guiding and enabling the company to be a force for good and a force for growth. Now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Damon. I'm going to make you the presenter, Damon, so you can take it away from here, and we'll go from there.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're at in the world. Thank you for this opportunity just to spend a little time with the P&G family and share some thoughts and some reflections and some insights on how we're thinking about really just the importance of corporate reputation. What are some of the steps that we've seen not only P&G take, but others take in the past year that have resulted in increased trust, which, as you'll see shortly, we believe has a meaningful and substantive business impact. And then what are just be in discussion about what are some of the things that we've seen in the broad environment, things that have provided inspiration for us to continue to do, and some things that frankly have provided some lessons for us to learn from. So with that, I'm going to try to share my screen, and you'll tell me if we do a good job and you can see my screen right now. So what I'll do is let me give you just a little bit of context for what I believe is the environment that we're operating in. And frankly, oftentimes we think about our corporate reputation being looked at through the eyes of not only just our consumers that we serve, but through a wide range of stakeholders, alumni, employees, future recruits, stakeholders like government and community members. And many of those people get their news from a wide range of sources. What we're seeing as won't come as a surprise is that more and more of the news content is really geared for a mobile and social world. And what that means is we're oftentimes in a headline-driven environment. And what that does is sometimes makes jobs for people like me a little bit more difficult because that content needs to be compelling and visual. It needs to be received from sources that different people believe are credible. And in, frankly, the state of the world that we're in right now, not everyone views the same organizations or individuals as credible. And then we often find that there's oftentimes a rush to news, right? What is it that gets people to look at something on your LinkedIn feed or your Facebook feed or your Twitter feed? Some of those things are pure journalism. Some of them are opinions. Some of those just happen to be the thoughts of people who are popular because of the way that the algorithms work. And so what we're recognizing is that truth is in the eye of the beholder. And so it really is becoming more and more incumbent upon us to make sure that we are providing that news and information in a way that's accessible to many different people in the way that they want to do it. Specifically to today's topic, as we think about, crisis communication, we know that stories with interesting conflict draw the most attention. Whether it is big brands that are ubiquitous. If you think about a brand like Facebook that carries the water for all of the social media companies, whether it's mystery, when you look at brands that have interesting stories and people oftentimes want to know the behind the scenes stories, or sometimes where there's a specific issue. I think we're all familiar with the storied saga of Tide Pods and the many different groups that have been supportive of our efforts. They are not supportive of that. But we know that, like you have one issue voters in politics, you have our consumers, sometimes people are interested in one topic. But all of these different things really broaden the lens to what we think makes interesting stories. And we know that corporate trust is at an all-time low, and we'll spend a little time talking about that today. But one of the words that you'll see me use today a lot is the word trust, right? And why is trust important? And it's not just a notion that we like to be liked. We know that to the greater degree that consumers trust our brands, they will purchase our brands. And so what you're looking at right now is a chart from a company called Edelman, which is the largest independent public relations agency in the world. They publish an annual study called the Edelman Trust Barometer. It's something you can look up on Google. And basically what you're seeing here is, what are some of the factors that really drive purchase criteria for consumers around the world. Obviously, you have things like value and quality that are tops on the list. But when people say, "Can I trust this brand?" it's actually the number 3 driver of purchase intent. So ensuring that our brands are known, that they're trusted, that our actions match our words, and then on the issues that are most important to our consumers, people know where we stand and they believe the words that we say is incredibly important. So trust is one of the things that we track on all of our brands, and we actually track it, for the company as well, because in times of crisis, we know that the image and reputation and the trust factor of a company actually supersedes that of a brand. When you look at what some of the changes are over the past year, we continue to see increases in consumer safety and trust in terms of value, and really increasing trust for people. All right, and so these are, if you look at over a year-by-year change in what consumers are telling us is most important, we're seeing increasing drivers of these, and each of these have gone up more in the past 12 months than they have in the entire time that the Edelman Trust Barometer has been going, so for more than 20 years. So really, what we'd like to refer to as the global state of trust crisis is really shifting the values that are there. And importantly, for us as the world's largest advertiser, while advertising continues to be important, we know that trust isn't something that is bought. It's something that's earned in addition to something that needs to be told, right? So at the top of the screen, you'll see some data there that talks about the percentage of consumers that are in some way, shape, or form avoiding advertising, right? Whether that's installing a pop-up blocker, whether that's cutting the cord and getting away from traditional linear TV, whether that is, and how they consume their news. Advertising is something that consumers have not always been receptive to, right? And so as we earn that trust, obviously advertising plays an important role of helping us get the reach for consumers. But when you look at the things that are driving more trust, personal experience, not only, does a product do what it said it's going to do on the package? What do I read about the brand when I turn on the TV news, or when I read it in the newspaper, or what do I see in my social media feed? So really the importance of earned media in terms of driving consumer trust. And then importantly, what are other people saying about it? I liken this to, how do we find out restaurant recommendations in a time when we could all go out to restaurants? If a friend says, "Hey, I had a really great night at that restaurant," you're much more likely to do that. If they say I had a terrible meal or had terrible service, obviously that recommendation carries a tremendous amount of weight. And likely the flip side is also true. When you don't have strong reputation or strong trust, we know that there are negative, severely negative impacts for brands as it applies. One of the ways in which we track the impact of trust and reputation is what we call through the RepTrack score, which is put together by an organization called the Reputation Institute. And again, part of what we always want to do, as many of you know, P&G is a very data-driven organization, is we try to really break down and say, do I trust a company or not trust a company, is a big thing. But what are some of the vectors of consumer trust when it comes to reputation? And that's what you see on the left-hand side of your screen. Obviously, do you have quality products and services? But how innovative is a company, all right, is a factor of trust. Is it well run and well managed? So from a governance standpoint, not only is important to investors, we know that that's important to consumers. Are you treating the environment and the communities in which you live and work? Are you doing the right things there? So citizenship continues to be increasingly important for many of our consumers and stakeholders. as is workplace, right? Is this a great place to work? Do we treat our employees well? And the reputation of employees carries an outsized weight when it comes to corporate reputation. Leadership and financial performance are also really key factors. And those things, again, just aren't philosophical. We know that we can track our strength in each of those 7 areas on your left-hand screen, on the left-hand side of your screen, to associated actions from consumers and stakeholders on the right-hand screen. Do they buy our brands? Do they recommend them to friends? Are we crisis proof? No company gets it right 100% of the time, as we'll spend some time talking about today. So in those instances where a company does make a misstep, how much leeway do consumers and stakeholders give them? We refer to that as being crisis proof, or in other words, having a company get the benefit of the doubt. So all of those things really lead to behaviors from consumers. A couple of more insights, because we know one of the biggest trends that we've seen over the past 6 years in specific is that how companies are responding to issues of the day continue to be really important factors, right? And so 44% of consumers around the world just earlier, or not earlier this year, late last year, have said that they've started using a new brand because of the way that they've responded to COVID-19. So doing the right thing, having a positive reputation for doing the right thing really does make a difference. It's not only the right thing to do, it does have a meaningful connection for the brands. What we also know is that these instances, the brands have as much to gain as they have to lose. And that's the chart that you see on the right-hand side there. So a lot of upside for brands who can be seen to doing the right thing. Another eye chart that I won't spend a lot of time, but what I will say on this one is that oftentimes when we talk about the perception of values and putting people and values over profits, it's sometimes shown up as something that's really important to millennials or to younger consumers. What we know, and the data plays it out, is that it's really important to all consumers. So across the top, that top chart there, the top line graph, you'll see is it's really important, right? Not only just for boomers, right, but for all consumers, that we know that it's really important that you're treating your people well, and you see the variety of the scores that are there. Employees, care for the environment, what are you doing in the community, are just as important across as some of these other the factors. The last point that I'll make before we kind of get into some of the examples looking back on 2020 is that we view reputation as a critical part of our growth strategy that you guys have heard so much from David and John over the past couple of years. The good thing is that P&G's reputation scores are significantly improving. We've had line improvements over the past 3 years, moving us from a company with an average or better than average reputation. We're clearly right now in the strong zone and headed towards excellent. So we do think that a lot of the things that we're doing are moving us in the right direction. And a big part of that comes from obviously doing the right things, but leadership really plays a critical role in what we're doing. 76% of consumers, again, a very noticeable uptick over the past couple of years, really attribute the image and reputation of a company side by side of those that sit in the C-suite, namely the CEO, right? So this is something that is not, just the job of people like myself charged with their public reputation. It's something that really has an impact for everyone across the entire enterprise. So let me just catch my breath here. And then what I want to do is perhaps take a trip down memory lane and look at some of the big headlines from a corporate standpoint that came to life in 2020, and frankly talk about what are some of the things that worked well, what are some of the things that didn't, what we as a company have learned from some of them, and then really enter into a dialogue with the group that we have on the phone. So one of the key headlines, I'll start on the left-hand side. Really, when we look at corporate activism, was the campaign where more than 1,200 companies joined a campaign called Stop Hate for Profit. Stop Hate for Profit was an alliance of organizations started by the Anti-Defamation League, the NAACP, Color of Change, a number of different groups that basically really wanted to stem the flow of hate speech and harmful, dangerous content that was propagating with not as many controls as they thought would be appropriate on many of the social media channels. And Facebook was the lead company in their eye for that time. And basically what that led to was a number of companies who stepped forward to say, hey, we believe that this is important enough that if these social media platforms don't take a stand, we as corporate entities are going to vote with our dollars and pull our advertising. And for a period ranging from 1 month to some companies for whom it's still ongoing, a number of advertisers pulled their advertising from this. And I think this was probably one of the largest united elements of corporate activism that we had seen in recent time. Now, P&G also took a stand during this time to say, hey, we absolutely believe that this is important. And much like we've done in the past, we too are going to vote for our dollars. But I thought it was interesting how Facebook responded to this. One of the things that I think that they didn't do particularly well is frankly come out and frankly talk transparently about what they had been doing and what left was the opportunity for them to still do. And now, of course, all of these things, when you start talking about corporate reputation, there's an element of what you do and what you say, right? And never what you say, never can what you say become more important than the fundamental action. But I do think the Facebook Stop Hate for Profit boycott was a good example in crisis management, is that you can't talk your way out of a crisis unless you have meaningful, sustained action that demonstrate that you understand the issues and concerns of your stakeholders. It's going to be really difficult for you to talk your way out of an issue. And I think, since then, Facebook has taken a number of steps to get their content under control, to take some additional steps in moderating that content, and being transparent on how much hate and harmful content that they're doing. What are they doing to respond in this case? Whether that was investment, the number of people, the amount of technology that they were doing, and frankly, reporting on the progress that they've made. They've done enough to end at least the phase 1 of this boycott. And frankly, I think what we saw in other social media platforms, and I'll give Twitter some credit here, is Twitter was much more responsive. They had their CEO out transparently talking about what they were doing. They published what they call a policy center online, so you can actually go online, see their principles very clearly, and see many more examples of the enforcement of their action. And so one of the themes that you'll see throughout a lot of these examples that we'll talk about is transparency. Simply, you just can't, get online or on TV and say, hey, this is important to us and we're going to do it. People want proof. They want to see leadership engagement, and they want to know where the progress is towards some of these things that are important. We see that similarly to what Coca-Cola and Pepsi are doing in the plastics debate. Given all of the push for environmental sustainability, it's not enough that they step forward and say, hey, yes, it's important. What is the scorecard that these companies are publishing? And again, that's why things like, for us, the annual sustainability and citizenship report that we produce, we continue to expand every year, because we know that different people want different levels of transparency and accountability, whether that's the average consumer who wants a certain level, whether that is consumer advocates or NGOs who want a different level. That transparency has to really be important. With all of the issues that we've seen on racial equity this year, how companies have responded to some of these issues has also been incredibly important in the Black Lives Matter movement. I think, I reflect back, it was just 2 years ago when you had a company like Audi that put out an ad during the Super Bowl that said, hey, gender equality is really important to Audi. They had this wonderfully creative commercial that talked about, women in the automotive industry, but consumers went very quickly to their website and saw that there weren't any women on their board of directors, and that their C-suite was full of white men, right? And so that was an opportunity and an example of where, the advertising didn't match the reality. And 2020 was a continuation of that, right? With many companies that when they stepped forward and said, hey, a statement like we support racial equality, consumers were, of course, glad to hear something like that, but they double clicked. They wanted to know quote unquote, where were the receipts? And they began to look and see how companies were carrying through those types of statements and their actions. One of the things that popped up, not just in the US, but around the world, was companies that were selling skin whitening creams that were perceived to be pushing, more European standards of beauty versus global standards of beauty. Well, how do you say I'm all for racial equality and at the same time market some of these products in what some consumers might say was an irresponsible way? Different ways of holding those companies accountable. There was a day when many companies and many individuals posted a black box on Instagram as a statement of support for the Black Lives Matter movement. And very quickly thereafter, we begin to see lots of consumers say, well, that's great that you make these statements. Talk to me about what are your actions that you're saying. Talk to me about the composition of your boards of directors, of your senior management, of your employee bases, to say, how are these values coming to life, right? And we saw a number of companies get called on the carpet for either prior statements that they had made. In this case, Wells Fargo CEO making some very inappropriate statements, and an internal memo that's saying, well, the reason we don't have as many Black employees is because there was a limited pool of Black talent. Wells Fargo stock was impacted, and he was rightfully taken to task both internally and externally for some of the context of that statement. So things like that, really making sure that your actions match your words, and that you really understand the context for many of these rapidly facing or rapidly evolving issues continues to be really important, and that the talk that you talk is really matched by the walk that you walk. Ellen DeGeneres, who many of you know, is a leading talk show host in the U.S., known for her embrace of equality issues, both from a gender perspective as well from a LGBT perspective. Got called and held to task, lost a significant amount of advertisers when it became clear that what consumers were seeing on her talk show was frankly not how her company was being run according to a number of employees. And so this push for transparency, this push for employee voices, are something that we're seeing a lot of coming out. So I know we're approaching the 9:30 hour. I'll give a couple of examples, perhaps, of companies that I did thought responded well to some of the questions of corporate reputation over the past year, and then we'll open it up for your questions. So continue to put your questions in the chat box. Cybersecurity continues to be one of the top corporate risks that many Fortune 500 companies are making. And if you compare the Equifax breach, which happened a couple of years ago, and which the company was rightfully taken to task, not only for not having the appropriate internal controls, but frankly for their lack of transparency and senior leadership accountability for how they responded to it. Twitter did a really good job this year. Their CEO, Jack Dorsey, in mid-July, really was very transparent about a Twitter hack that resulted in a number of high-profile Twitter accounts being taken over. And in fact, it was actually the day after the Twitter hack happened that Jack appeared at P&G Signal's conference and spoke very transparently to an editor of Fast Company that really talked about what Twitter got right and what Twitter didn't get right. And for all of the outrage that people have when data breaches continue to happen, Twitter got a lot of credit because their leaders stepped forward. They talked about what they knew, when they knew it, what they got right, and then talked about the principles for how they were going to manage it going forward. And I think that's one of the classic mistakes that many companies make when they're doing crisis management, is they try to have all of the answers immediately. And what you know in the first hour of a crisis never turns out to be what 24, 48 hours after the crisis, or weeks and months later. But what they did is they really talked about the principles by which they're going to manage it, the principles by which they're going to share information, and they got a lot of credit. And frankly, they didn't see a long-term decline in the trust rankings that they had. Again, another company that I think even after some early missteps, stepped up to the plate and did some things well in the later stages of their crisis, is what Johnson & Johnson did throughout, balancing, the crisis that they've had with the lawsuits that frankly didn't even go in their favor as a result to talc and some of the lawsuits that where at least that the company lost related to talc being a carcinogen. Again, transparency on what they knew. Johnson & Johnson didn't do a very good job on that one. But when a company can step forward and say, hey, we've made some mistakes, regardless of what you believe about the merits of the issue, when you can stand forth and say, hey, this is what we got right, and this is what we got wrong, and this is how we're going to manage it going forward, continues to be things that earn some trust going forward. So in terms of some of the broad headlines and lessons that I think we take away from some of these is transparency meets accountability. And you can't really talk about crisis right now without talking about some of the things that some of our political figures are tackling right now. And that while there's just great desire for transparency, there's also a great desire for accountability. So companies talking about, what are the corrective actions, and whether that's individuals that have been disciplined within a company or process changes. Transparency is great, but transparency without accountability is not necessarily going to result in a stronger reputation. What I would say is it's really important now more than ever that companies understand that their crisis plans are not something that you develop, you put in a drawer, and you just whip out, a statement when you happen to have it, right? We saw that with the Pepsi crisis from a couple of years ago when they had some tone deaf advertising. Really understanding the context of social issues is key. What the social issues, the context for a social issue in the US is going to be very different than the context of that same issue in Europe or in Asia or in Latin America or in the Middle East. So understanding how companies need to respond locally also continues to be really, really important. One of the things that I often talk to our own teams about is when we find ourselves in hot water, either because of a real or a perceived issue, is to make sure that we're responding strategically and not therapeutically. No consumer agrees with every step that we take, and how you acknowledge even the concerns that people have is really important. I harken back to some of the advertising that we've done over the past couple of years, whether it was campaigns like the Talk or the Look or the Gillette campaign that addressed toxic masculinity, really helping people understand why we do what we do continues to be really important. And sometimes it's easy to say, well, I'm sorry that you feel that way. Well, in reality, sometimes we can't be sorry for how everyone feels about every issue at every time. I mean, we're guided by a set of values and principles, and it's important that we stand up for those values and principles, even when there are things that are not espoused by 100% of our consumers or 100% of our employees. The point 4 that I make here is that opportunism never wins. And we saw this early steps in the COVID-19 crisis, when frankly there were companies who spent more time advertising how they were responding and what they were doing than actually doing the good work itself. And so, one of the things that we decided in that time is that the greatest mission that we could do from our brand is to be helpful and useful. So we didn't send out a press release talking about the tens of millions of dollars that we were donating. We just got to the work, and we had other people speak on our behalf. And then the advertising that we did, we made sure our brands were being helpful, useful, and informative, with the view that that consumers would see through that and see that we were doing the right things, versus simply advertising that we love doctors and nurses and supported them at every step of the way. There's a balance there, but what it shows is that really being true and transparent to our consumers and being helpful and useful really did win the day. Obviously, the company that you keep matters, and frankly, how you associate yourselves with different controversial figures, even in doing the right things, matter. I mean, there was a big controversy over the past year as a number of companies were called to the White House to do really important and really meaningful work in terms of their contributions to address the COVID-19 crisis. Some of those companies did it in a good way, and others got criticized for even their association with what companies were doing. I think a number of the medical companies, the vaccine companies, did a really good job of attempting to balance, obviously, the political nature of vaccinations that was happening with their core missions of what they needed to do. So none of those are easy things to do, but how you align yourself really matters, and really not letting other people speak for you, but speaking for yourself on those controversial issues. The last point that I'll make before our discussion really has to do with a phrase that we use often in terms of breaking into jail. So often, or so many times, consumers step into it, or companies step into it when it's really not our issue to manage. You know, and I look at that, and you know, every day we get hundreds of consumer comments that want to know what's our position on every individual issue. You know, what do we think about impeachment? What do we think about what's happening at the Capitol? What do we think about all of those issues? And we really try to take a balanced view to make sure that we're espousing a point of view when it has meaning and relevance for our consumers, for our employees, for our stakeholders, and when there's a direct connection with their values and principles. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have to have a point of view on every single issue. So we call that not really breaking into jail. And just because something is a crisis for another entity or another one of our competitors doesn't mean that we need to wade into some of those pools. So we try to run the play that's right for P&G. And again, everyone doesn't always agree, but that's just one of the principles that we use that I think has served us well. So let me pause there. I know we're at 9:35, so a little bit over, and really just enter into a dialogue. What do you guys think about some of the information that's been shared? What are some of the corporate crises for the past year that you think have been handled pretty well? And which of those do you feel should have been handled differently, whether that's something that relates to P&G or not?
Well, thank you so much, Damon. Very, very insightful. Really appreciate it. We've had several questions that have come in, so I'll go through as many of these as I can. Now, so one question is, are the trends that you're talking about, are they similar around the globe, or do they vary? Does something stand out as being very different in different regions?
What I would say is probably one of the biggest differences, excuse me, that we see among some of the trends really relates to the company's involvement in social issues. I mean, you see that very much prominent in the Americas, right? So if you talk to consumers in the US, Canada, Puerto Rico, and Latin America, they very much expect companies to be stepping in and taking a leading role and really, frankly, balancing out some of the mistrust that we're seeing from companies and government officials. We do not see that to the same degree, candidly, in Europe or in Asia. And that's, and again, painting every country with a broad swath. But we see that even in terms of the role of the private sector and stepping up and providing social aid in the midst of COVID-19. I mean, in the Americas, there was a much higher expectation, as there was in China. I will say China is a little bit different, that companies step in and really assist the world with opening back up, getting aid into the right places. Whereas, people leaned first and foremost and more heavily on government entities to do that in Europe. And we see that carry through in a number of different ways. If you think about a number of the large campaigns that we do for an organization such as the United Way, there's a much higher expectation, even that individual employees contribute to some of those campaigns, and those really have to do with many of the social constructs that are different across different companies. So that's an example of where some of those trends really differ. We also face some of these things as it relates to the role of religion in many different parts of the world, right? There are different standards, expectations, and frankly, laws in many different parts of the world. So when we talk about some of the topics from a citizenship standpoint, you will see us execute those citizenship objectives in different ways, always with a view to what is culturally right, what is respectful, but consistent with our values and principles. So those are a couple of the differences, and that frankly means that we need to respond differently in different parts of the world.
Very good. Thank you so much. And as you might imagine, we have a few questions relative to the current political climate and that sort of thing. So I will ask the questions, and I don't know whatever you want to talk through. But you talked about breaking into jail, and I know we all know P&G as a company that does take a stand, but also you don't want to break into jail sometimes with issues as you mentioned that are not really yours. So one of the questions is, how do you determine when to wade into issues like what happened at the Capitol last week? So how do you determine, do we want to make a statement, do we get involved, and that sort of thing, or not?
Yeah, and those things are never black and white. I mean, I think, if I step back over the past year and maybe give a couple of examples, one of the things that we always aim to do is to ensure that we're creating the environment where our employees who come to work every day understand our values and principles and understand how we live our values and principles. And we understand that many of these types of issues, whether it's some of the equality and inclusion issues, whether it's what happens in DC, they have a meaningful impact on how people live their lives, right? I mean, these aren't things that people, drop when they enter the doors of one of our offices or one of our plants. And so we try to always start with what is the human impact of what's going on in the world around us, and therefore, does that require or necessitate a reinforcement of our values, right? When we looked at some of the travel bans that were being instituted several years ago, but dating back to 2016, number one, there was a business impact, right? I mean, there were people who could not get to where they needed to get to, whether that was an expat family, whether that was people who were traveling for business. That necessitated a direct response because there was a direct business impact. If I look at some of the racial equality issues, that necessitated that because people are wondering, hey, where do we stand on that issue, and will the company continue to exercise and to promote some of the values that we know are really important. On something like the Capitol, obviously, the company's taken a stance that there's no room for violence, that we believed in free and fair elections. We've encouraged our people to take an active role in the electoral process. That didn't start this year, that has gone on a number of years. And so we believe in the integrity of that process, and that the will of the individual people need to be out there. And so we were out there throwing our weight behind statements that were made by the Business Roundtable and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. That doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to go on, NBC News or CNBC and to take a leading role in that one, because the core issue there was one about safety, was one about law and order. And I don't know that people are looking to P&G to reinforce whether law should be enforced. We think that that's something fairly universal. It is an opportunity for us to reinforce, our belief that many of the underlying, issues that led up to some of the events next week are some of the things that we continue to do out there, right? We've been, Mark Pritchard has been out there for a number of years talking about the role of hateful content online and how we didn't want our brands associated with that. That's not an issue of the day. We've said, hey, that this is something that's important. So we try to make sure that when we talk about these issues, we talk about them on terms that are relevant for P&G, for P&G people and P&G brands, that the aim is never about being political, and that we can link it back to something that has a direct correlation to P&G values and how we're going to operate our business. We've had employees or recruits that want to know, how are we responding to everything from the environment to some of the racial injustices that have happened. That is material enough for people to decide whether P&G is the type of place that cares about more things than the bottom line. And oh, by the way, those things do impact the bottom line. So again, that's the lens that I'd look at it. Is there a direct connection with P&G values, P&G people, and P&G business that we believe are important for us to do, and sometimes we believe an independent voice is appropriate and relevant, we'll do that. And whether we do that, shoulder to shoulder with the business community, as we've done, over the past week or so, the how is going to differ, because what we want to do is you want to avoid, if people are talking about more how you responded to an issue than the issue itself, then I've not done my job and the company's not done a job. So we want to also make sure that the focus remains on the core issues all the time.
Very good. Yeah, let me switch gears just a little bit. I know we've got a lot of folks who are in the commercial sort of, part of the business, that sort of thing. So one of the questions that have come in is, I'd love to hear more about the link between brand PR and corporate reputation. What are the key points of intersection, and how is your team keeping in touch with the hot button issues in the world that are evolving so rapidly?
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges that we face is when is a brand speaking for a brand, and when is a brand speaking for a company, right? But one of the challenges that we oftentimes have, and I'll use the social issue construct here, is that we believe that there are certain brands, by the nature of the brand, by the way they advertise, and by the way consumers see them, that lead different brands to have different licenses for the conversations that they can have. If I think about some of our brands, frankly, in the beauty space, a lot of the conversation in why a consumer chooses to align him or herself with some of our brands goes far beyond the functional benefit, right? When you look at a brand like Olay and what does Olay stand for, or what does SK2 stand for, they stand more for just the pure performance aspects. It has something to do with how a consumer feels when she uses that product, or what her long-term goal is when using that. And so over time, the nature of the conversation that an SK2 or an Olay or a brand like Secret can have is very different than a brand like Charmin or Tide, for example. Right? For a brand that has been talking about women's strength and women's empowerment, people are expecting now to hear more on these issues from Secret, right? So the conversation that Secret has is based on a history. It's based on having clear brand actions and activities, whether that is how they've hired women directors to produce some of their ads, whether it's the tone and equity in their advertising. I think if all of a sudden you start an ad for Charmin talking about racial equality, you would say, is that what I expected to hear from a tissue brand, right? And so it really does go back to what's the long-term equity of that brand, what's that brand's degree of consumer affinity to have some of these conversations, and that's some of the guidance that we have. I mean, it was interesting. I mean, there were brands that, in the midst of some of the issues that people said, hey, well, should our brand come out and take a statement? And we've said, frankly, if this is a conversation that you've never had before, is now the right time to have that conversation? Do you have the track record of, number one, doing all of the right things that show that this is a value, and then you can talk about them. So we never want our brands to be in the position, like I mentioned, Audi, of espousing a value where they haven't walked the talk, right? And so when it comes to diversity and inclusion, we look at things. Are you advertising on diverse-owned media? What's the racial and gender makeup of the teams working in your brand? How are you supporting these causes? And if you've earned the right by virtue of your actions, then you can do that. And our job in a corporate standpoint is frankly to help the brands see around those corners, understand that, hey, there's times when it's appropriate for the company to step up and to go back to an issue like we're dealing with, things at the Capitol. There's a reason that Procter & Gamble as a company stands forth and does that, because it's a corporate value, not necessarily appropriate for every individual brand to go off and take a stand on some of those issues, because how do you decide that issue A is important and issue B is not? So it's a real delicate balancing act. What I would say at the end of the day is the corporation should always be standing out front or side by side with the brand, and the brands can go a step further. But it really gets down to what's the consumer expectation that people have of those brands. That's what guides our degree of forwardness, if you will.
Got it. Very good. And there's another question that says, what is the line basically between optimism and conservatism when it comes to talking about the good things that we do? How do you sort of balance that out?
Yeah, it's interesting. What I'd say is that's still an active debate, right? And how, it's a balance of, at times, if we don't tell people what we're doing, they may not know. At other times, it's the balance of ensuring that we're speaking in a chorus of other people who can help validate some of the actions that we're doing. So as an example, let me talk about perhaps COVID-19, right? P&G has stepped forward and donated, tens of millions of dollars in cash, products, in-kind support, the time and energy of individuals to help everyone from a local hospital organization to a charitable organization to government officials help navigate through that. And frankly, some of our competitors were first, louder and bolder in their commitments. And they said, oh, we've given X number of dollars. And there was a push by many of our people to say, well, should we give more? And one of the things that we tried to balance was, where does the focus belong? Is the focus more about us as a company, or is the focus more about the people that we're serving? And so we took a longer term view that demonstrated, here were our principles, here were the categories and the lanes that we were in. And over time, what we saw was that many of our partners talked about the good work that P&G was doing with them, rather than, again, and I'll be critical of one of our competitors. If you look at the amount of advertising time that they spent talking about what they were doing. And so that's a judgment call that we feel fits better with P&G's equity. We've never been about a company that was, look at me, look at how great that I am. We've always been about action speaking louder than words. Now, at times, do we get that balance? Are we too conservative? Yes, I actually do believe that we are, because, for me, whether you don't put that on advertising, that might be more appropriate for a website or for social media, but there are certain consumers who want that. And so our strategy is for stakeholders and consumers who want to find that information, we'll make it available to them. So we created a COVID-19 hub on pg.com that when people were interested in it, what we said is, hey, our message about the consumers, about front lines, about giving people the help that they need. If you want to learn more about what we were doing, we're going to tell you where you can go get that information. And we felt that that was the right balance. So again, at the end of the day, it comes down to a judgment call and doing the right things in context. But again, those are things where I think a brand or a company has to know its values before you go into a crisis situation. A crisis is a terrible time to be searching for and finding your values, because in that time, what you want to be doing is reinforcing the great things that people know about you, not trying to get them to change the way that they think about you. So that's the way we think about that balance there.
Got it. Thank you so much. And we literally have like 2 more minutes or less for this final question. And I apologize, we've had a lot of really great questions. We haven't been able to address all of them, but there's this one part of one of the questions that I will address. And that is, with your caring human hat on, knowing what you know and all of this, what is the one thing that you wish all alumni did to help drive positive change across, in the world?
That's an excellent question. I think part of how companies engage in crises is really complicated by the current environment that we find when we make so many judgments on headlines, right? I heard this one thing and I saw the headline and I don't take time to really fully understand what's going on. And so I say that is I think whether you're an alumni or whoever you are, is taking time to just go beyond the headlines, whether when you're seeing something that you're supportive of, helping us understand why you think we're doing a good job. And contrary, when you see us doing something that you don't think is the right direction, giving us some thoughtful input to go along with the criticism, because we read it all, we value it all, but it's really hard sometimes for us to gauge the reaction when people are reacting to just a headline or just a tweet or just a post. We try to be holistic in the stories that we tell, to give people multiple proof points. And right, I mean, we've got 99,000 active employees and more than double that number of retirees and alumni. But understanding the why and going beyond the headlines is, I think, something that helps us and that helps many different companies understand when we're getting it right and understand when we're getting it wrong, right? Because we really do value that. But going beyond the headlines would be number one. And then what I would say is, it's human nature to share things that we're critical of. I mean, think about when you've had a terrible experience, you're very likely to share that. But when we get something right, being able to share that with people and say, hey, these are the good guys and girls that are getting it right, whether that's Procter or another company, but sharing that positive story, I think are two things now. So those are two things that I would aspire for a little bit more of in the world, especially in a world where so much of what we read is negative criticism. There's room for the positive in there, and I'd love for us to spend a little bit more time on that in conversation.
Absolutely. Really wonderful insight throughout the entire presentation, as well as very prudent advice here, this takeaway. Thank you so much again, Damon. I've just got a few more announcements I'm going to make, but I want to thank you again for taking this opportunity to create this opportunity for us. Thank you so much. And our next guest speaker is Angie Hicks. She's the co-founder of Angie's List and Chief Customer Officer of Angie Home Services. And that presentation is going to be done on February 9th at 9 o'clock Eastern. This is Amir Ganad again, your host, and I thank you for your participation, and I wish you the very best and look forward to having you on the future calls. Thanks again for participating.